Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. For as little as $3, you can get access to our Discord community where hosts Ikoi, Hero and myself host weekly live discussions, so come join us. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email it's not just in your head @gmail.com. And this week's random call out goes to patron Ash Turner.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
We're doing a episode on the troubled teen industry, and we will be interviewing somebody that has gone through this industry. I'm just giving a basic background on the industry for our listeners. So the troubled teen industry is a network of private youth programs, therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, religious academies, wilderness programs, drug rehabilitation centers, and also it could be group homes as well. And it dates back to at least 50 years. The majority of the facilities are private for-profit companies, but nonprofits and faith-based groups also make up for a significant portion of the industry. And generally, what they promise to treat is often children who have been labeled with diagnoses such as oppositional behaviors and disorders, and can be wide-ranging from addiction to even eating disorders. Some of the more, I guess, well-known troubled teen industry also, it has changed over the years, and there is a lot less of it, although it still exists, are the teen programs that used to, cure quote unquote gay and lesbian children. So the gay conversion camps and treatment of yesteryear that still exist today would be considered part of the troubled teen industry. A lot of youth end up in this industry through parents and families. State and local governments pay for these programs to take kids out of foster care. Also tends to be part of, filling up the overfill of like the juvenile justice systems. School districts have been known to place youth through their individualized education programs. It can also impact the refugee population because resettlement agencies have been known to place youth in these programs as well. It is estimated that basically about 120,000 to 200,000 people, young people, reside in some kind of group home, boot camp, correctional facility, or residential treatment center in the United States. The exact number of private placement is unknown, but it's guesstimated to be about 50 per 1,000 of these youth are placed privately by their parents. And so this is an industry that is a huge business. It receives an estimated $23 billion of annual public funds to purportedly treat the behavioral and psychological needs of vulnerable youth. And it tops in terms of profit. To give an example, Sequel is a for-profit facility that regularly tops an annual profit of about $200 million. 90% of their revenue comes from Medicaid and Medicare, and approximately 500 additional federal, state, and local programs. Programs pay sequel as much as $800 a day for each child at their facility. And there is now a organization called Breaking Code Silence, which is a survivor-led campaign created in 2014 to encourage people who have endured abuse in this industry to speak out about their experiences. Again, this is, ultimately a huge industry that has very little regulation and very little oversight. So that is some of the basics behind the industry. And this information that I've listed out comes courtesy of the American Bar Association.
I did watch a documentary about, a small section of the teen industry. And I think the thing that shocked me was that they weren't just teens. This was like 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
it
can be. It can start really young, and yeah, I guess and like some of the quote unquote kidnapping that goes, because a lot of times parents are afraid that like their kids will run away if they know they're going to these places, so they'll arrange for kidnapping, and sometimes that's like an independent company that like basically just makes a whole thing out of organizing with parents to quote unquote do interventions, which basically is like, grabbing kids in the middle of the night.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of parents are terrified, right? They don't know how to deal with these kids with their problems, and so they are very vulnerable to very confident marketing and guarantees that a lot of these programs, make without due evidence.
I am EJ Schleifer, and I went to Mount Bachelor Academy and Seuss, Idaho. They're both located in the USA, and they're both troubled teen institutions. And they're both owned by the same company, which is why I went to both of them, I'm certain. And I was sent there because my mom needed help with parenting. And it's taken me a couple decades to feel like I came to a place where I've largely healed from that experience.
Thank you for, coming and talking about, what has been a really difficult experience for you. Because this is this is an issue that's gotten some traction, especially because, some celebrities have experienced this as well. Notably, like, Paris Hilton, Paris Jackson, and Bad Baby have opened up and talked about their experience, and I have also heard it, described as like, the troubled teen industry is in part, not necessarily the entire industry, but in part is like a very expensive, punitive juvenile detention for wealthy teens has been, one factor of the industry, definitely. It's interesting that you mentioned that your facility was in Idaho, because Idaho actually has the highest number of women incarcerated in all the states. So was your facility a co-ed facility?
Yeah, both of them were.
So it was because, a lot of them are segregated by gender. So yours was a co-ed facility. And you said you went to 2 different ones.
Yeah. So I started at Mount Bachelor Academy, which was, it was co-ed. It was in the middle of nowhere in Oregon. And of course, that was intentional for the many people who attempted to run away. The nearby town, Prineville, knew about the facility and, of course, the police would assist when there was a runaway.
Right.
And so they were both co-ed. So for MBA, yeah, we were separated by our sleeping spaces, although like only separated by distance, which I believe some people took advantage of. And obviously, I'm sure there were whatever trysts within, the gendered dorm, like within a single gendered dorm. And then for the SUS, sorry, what does SUS stands for? I don't remember. It's SUWS. And there was an Idaho location and also a Carolina. So there was SUS Idaho and SUS Carolinas. I know there were at least 2 locations.
Okay. And what kind of, because the troubled teen industry is a kind of an expansive one that can range from, basically like a boarding school type situation all the way to like a wilderness camp, right? So what type of facilities were they?
Yeah, thanks. So MBA was more like a boarding school. Once you got to, I believe, phase 2, you could start going to class again. So when you started, you actually had a pause in your academic activity. Incidentally, I know that some people who went to MBA had difficulty attaining their properly credentialed diploma, and had to actually, even though they graduated high school there, they actually had to go on and get their GED, which for the price of the school, I think is, I don't consider the students clients, by the way. The parents were the clients, but the students were the ones who were subjected to absolutely everything. The parents just paid money. The parents just got what they wanted. Anyway, and so that was MBA, and then SUS was a wilderness program. It was 21 days, a 21-day program, and we camped, and I absolutely loved it. I loved it. I wish I had been there the whole time.
Yeah, some people do get, a lot out of some of the wilderness programs. So what led you to go to SUS from the Mount Bachelor? Was that supposed to be like an additional punishment for you, or was that just a change in facility for whatever, logistic reason, or what was kind of the transfer there?
I began the therapeutic activities at MBA, and the first life step, they were called life steps. I think maybe they were called something else before. Like, I was there at a time when the program had just somewhat significantly changed from like a 2-year program to a 1-year program. Of course, they were chasing profit. They were trying to, pump more kids out and have a more streamlined program and just kind of like fix you up and send you out, I guess. And so there was a bit of a transition. I think some people were there who had been through the old program, and the life steps had different names, and maybe they were like, each life step had a name: the Bridge, Forever Young, Venture 1, Venture 2, and so on. At the time I went there, it was the first one was called the Bridge. And what the Bridge is, I think it's team building with your cohorts. So the people who came to the facility at the same time were put into a cohort, and the staff were trying to facilitate, connection between us so that we could begin go through the therapeutic journey together. And I was very uncomfortable. I felt I did not feel ready to connect to other people. I didn't feel a connection to the people that I was meeting. Before I went to MBA, I knew people who did drugs, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with drugs, but I wasn't interested in it. Right. My friends didn't talk about it. I made it clear I didn't want to do it. And It was not a thing in my life. I had never had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And the worst thing I did, it's funny. My mom thinks the worst thing I did, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little tangential, but is my mom thinks the worst thing I did is I took her car. We only had one car. So anytime I drove, when I drove to school, whatever, did we have one car? I think we only had one car. I took it one night, right? And I wasn't supposed to do that. And I went and I had sex with my boyfriend at the time, and I came back and didn't tell her. I snuck out. And she thinks that was horrible. And I of course, that wasn't very nice. But like I was at his parents' house.
Right.
Like,
Right.
it's not, we weren't like, I don't know. Oh, we used a condom. Like, what do you want?
Like, I mean, yeah, to a certain degree, like, pretty common, right? Adolescent experience of like, taking parents' cars, sneaking out, right? Meeting up with your partner. Like, those are very common parts of, I think, a lot of people's adolescent experience. So ultimately, so that was the reason that your mother sent you to this facility. That was the main reason.
I think so. We don't talk about it because it immediately becomes very contentious. And I think that's because she feels guilty. I don't know if she really knows how much I think, I think for her it's subjective. I don't know if she knows how much I think it harmed me, but she knows it harmed me, certainly by now, because I told her I wanted to participate in the lawsuit against the school. I'm sure at some point I told her that I thought it was abusive. But, for a parent, I think that all of the parents who sent their kids there for whatever reason, they thought that it would help their kids. Whatever else they were thinking, and certainly I think it's true for some parents. And I think that certainly the children thought it was true. And that's also very damaging. Right. Which is that the parents didn't want to deal with their kids, just didn't want to parent their kids. So anyway, though there might have been bad reasons, for whatever reason, if they didn't want to parent their kid, they found a place that they thought could. And whether they were, for whatever else, I think that that's definitely true for all of the parents, for sure, for all of these programs. And I think that's part of the reason why it continues to be popular. And anyway, so I think that for my mother to confront that is to confront that she made a choice that harmed her child, and she never wanted to do that. So I think that's why it's hard to talk to her about it.
Right. So in that regard, you're, not 100% sure about her process and her reasoning of sending you.
Right.
So, do you want to kind of go into, some of the, you've talked about like some of the basics, and also just kind of like not fitting in also at this facility because you feel like, it wasn't necessarily a good match, I guess, in terms of like, what you were in for versus maybe what a lot of your cohorts were in for. Were you eventually able to make any kind of friendships with people at the facility? Okay.
For sure. Yeah. I definitely went on a tangent. So the initial, it was just hard to connect to these stories, these experiences that these people had. Like, this is, I had just had my first boyfriend at 17. I had sex a couple times, I guess.
Right.
A handful, no more than a handful. I wasn't, no offense, but to my friend who's going to listen to this, but I wasn't very impressed. Just like not with him, but sex is so built up.
Right.
And I thought I was being bad. And it was it's just sex.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I mean,
I thought it was this life-changing thing.
it's true. It's true. I mean, that's also an extraordinarily, common thing that I hear from, so many people about like, oh yeah, like I had sex for the first time. And it's actually a lot more common with, with women oftentimes are like, oh God, really? Is this it? Is this all there is? Really? Like this was what I don't understand what all the fuss was about. But yeah.
Exactly.
But yeah, so kind of, so basically, yeah, like kind of feeling really was this supposedly a facility that was maybe geared towards children with conduct disorder? Because yeah, so I mean every facility kind of like specializes in a population oftentimes. So if you had to determine the population of your particular facility, looking back, what would you say it was for?
Well, I mean, afterwards, I went on to study psychology myself, developmental psychology, and I majored in special ed, and I worked with a child who had conduct disorder. So, also for that reason, yeah, it was not a facility for that. It was that I would imagine that facilities specialized in, I think those would be maybe more like the military style, ranch style places, or a lockdown type situation where there was a lot more physical control of.
I mean, I know some
residents.
wilderness programs also kind of focus in on. Yeah, I mean, it's just again, it's unregulated, right? And being, an unregulated for-profit industry, you don't necessarily see an environment that's properly matched with, the people that they're serving, so that's why I ask. So, yeah.
I would say, like, from what I've learned about conduct disorder since then, now I say that I worked with someone who had conduct disorder, but I don't know that that was an appropriate designation necessarily. Just saying, because that's another thing, right? Defiance, is it oppositional defiance, or, do you have a bad relationship with a child? But anyway, that's a kind of separate issue. I mean, it was connected to all of this. Why are these programs so popular? Why is this happening?
Right.
But I would say that it was geared towards maybe more like what would be considered like maybe functioning, because of how much time we were able to be alone, and how much management, like self-management and like peer management, we were being asked to do. I would say that there were a lot of people there who, I would say the majority in my experience, but it could just be my misunderstanding, because I just had set myself as different, and as I don't have problems and they have problems. But my perception was that a lot of people were having a lot of sex, having unsafe sex, had drug problems, or dealing drugs. And when I say drug problems, I mean like as defined by parents. I'm not really sure about that. I mean, but I think most people there like were maybe habitual or off, or common, like often had used drugs. Because that seemed to be that a lot of my peers had experience with that.
Right.
So yeah.
And were kids at your facility mainly it seems like most of the kids at your facility were placed by parents rather than by the state.
Yeah. The wilderness program, I know, because it happened I think I don't want to talk about anyone other than myself, but I know somebody who it happened to. And so I know that the wilderness program, that Seuss, Idaho program, was referred through court programs at least sometimes. I don't think MBA was. I think MBA was always a parental placement, but I know that part of what was being alleged in the lawsuit that I believe was unsuccessful, but I'm not sure, was that these programs, like there would be multiple programs. So in this case, SUS and MBA, and I think other programs too. I think it was owned through Aspen. The Aspen was the parent company. And there are people who are like professionals, I guess, or I don't know. I mean, they're paid to do
Right.
it. Anybody can be a professional, I guess, if you dress right and
Right. Because that's one of the major aspects of a lot of, the staff at these places, right? They're not necessarily like, licensed therapists or
Absolutely not.
or even, in boarding school type situations, they do not have like education background. And they're still like, and parents are paying like, extraordinary amounts of money for their kids to be looked after by completely unlicensed and unregulated staff. So that in itself is a serious issue.
Can I just ask a dumb question? What is the difference between a boarding school then and, say, this particular institution or other troubled teen institutions? What sort of marks it out as different from sort of being sent away to live somewhere else?
Can't wait to answer this. Let's start with being yelled at for at least an hour twice a week by your peers and by adults. Like,
was this a therapeutic community type environment?
Yeah, that was therapy. That was group therapy.
Okay, yeah, that's that. I mean, that has lost, fortunately, some popularity. Some rehabs still utilize it, prisons still utilize it. But I'm just going to briefly explain for our listeners what therapeutic community is. And therapeutic community basically is kind of like this way of quote unquote therapy where they quote, break you down to build you back up. And the breaking down process is, supposed to be about like this very, very straightforward critique of all your faults. Right. And then, and kind of forcibly be made aware of all your minutia of faults so that, you can then like get support and correct them is kind of like and so a lot of times when people hear about this, they're like, oh, well, like it sounds a bit harsh, but it also makes sense. What's wrong with the therapeutic community? And one of the major things wrong with the actual how it's deployed in a lot of these communities is that you only get the breaking down part.
Right.
Is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think to a certain degree, the difference between like a standard boarding school and these environments, again, is that a lot of boarding schools are about, academics, preparing you for college, et cetera, versus, these places are, so boarding schools aren't necessarily disciplinary institutions. These facilities, by its nature, end up being extraordinarily disciplinary institutions. So not to talk over, EJ, just kind of explaining for our audience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I appreciate that. It's my understanding that these types of therapies are based on Synanon, which was developed for adult, which is important, right, which I hope we'll be able to talk about. For adult users of drugs. So I have used the word addict. I don't actually agree with all of that. framing. But anyway, I would say, adults who are using substances and who are experiencing problems in their lives due to their substance use. And so Synanon was developed in the 1980s.
I think it predates the 80s. I think the 80s was the peak of its popularity. Yeah.
Okay. And so, one of the things that Synanon used a lot was, absolutely, the breaking down to build you up, and was something that's known as attack therapy or confrontational therapy or interventions. That's kind of my understanding of where this whole type of approach comes from. And it was basically like it could easily be a mini intervention, like twice a week. And it can be really hard to get people to understand how extremely damaging that is. Particularly to a teenager.
Right. Just so, to put into context for our audience, Synanon has been described as one of the most dangerous and violent cults America has ever seen. Right. So their methods being utilized on children is absolutely it's a horrifying tragedy in many ways, because it does kind of point to one of the things that we talk about a lot on this podcast, and also Liam and I have had side conversations, but ultimately so many harm in our society comes in the guise of help. And also so much harm is ultimately, so much help is often about subjugating the powerless. And regardless of parental wealth to a certain degree, children as a class are very powerless class of people. And I think a lot of these institutions do, they are predatory against overwhelmed parents in promising behavior change through punishment, for the kids. They may not necessarily, because I think to a certain degree, a subset of parents, if they really knew what their kids were being subjected to, right, would be like, oh, no, I thought my child was getting help. But that is absolutely, unfortunately, not what happens in these facilities. I don't know how much you want to go into, talking about that process and that experience. So I'll leave that up to you.
Liam, did you want to say something?
Well, it just, because of the unregulated nature of it, just the idea of screening for sadists, I assume is just something that just doesn't happen. And then there must be a weird thing as well, because do these, these children, then are they encouraged to be sadistic? Or that, maybe, we're all sadistic or masochistic, but it's to what degree, right? So is it that through this experience, one way of surviving it or getting through it or gaining some sort of power is power over the other people, and that sadism is part of that answer? Does it encourage worse outcomes in that respect? I don't know.
I recently did an interview on this and really talked about for the first time how extremely damaging to peer relationships this approach is. I am extremely regretful of what I did while I was in that program. Of what I did while I was in that program, of how I treated other people, because we were absolutely encouraged and expected to confront other people.
Right.
We were I recall being spoken to and told to do it more, but I don't totally trust all of my memories over that time period, just because I'm not sure why. But I'm afraid that I saw myself so much as a victim that I made up some things. But they also accused me of making up things after they put me in situations where it was very, very easy to encourage false memories. So
Right.
yeah, just I cannot explain. I cannot possibly communicate the depth of gaslighting. Like when I finally learned about what gaslighting is, um, I can't express to anybody who hasn't experienced this what it does to a child learning about who they are, trying to make sense of the world, only recently able to even cognitively understand that the world can be quite complicated, and then subject them to this so-called confrontation therapy. It's the worst. I would say it's the worst time in human development to subject to someone to this type of practice. Obviously, very obviously, it's not actually therapy. I'm myself. I am.
I believe it's
I
abuse.
basically,
It's abuse.
yeah, yeah. No, thanks for labeling it. It certainly is abuse. But interestingly to me, I think, and somebody else, one of my friends recently pointed this out. I have made a career of taking the positions of working as the kind of people that I needed when I was going through this experience. So I've been a high school teacher for over 10 years. And now I'm planning on becoming a therapist, but a licensed therapist, or at the very least, somebody who is working on healing practices and not what I experienced. So you asked about like, how is it, like, some parents, if they knew what was going on, would have done something. And of course, that's true. And of course, I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that they controlled outgoing communication, communication with our parents, even, and certainly with outsiders, certainly with friends, was considered a privilege, as in, you had to earn it. We knew that everything that we, communicated with outsiders was monitored. Yeah, I remember, like, when I could first make phone calls, of course we complained, but I remember that there was a fear that if we really complained and if we really talked about what was going on, that we would face repercussions, like a work project or something like that. That was a certainty. You would get a work project if you talked about certain things.
Right. Well, I mean, I know that, because I have known several people that have gone through the industry. Some of them, one of the very tragic things, I think, for children being subjected to this is, and you talk about gaslighting, but it's often like some of their most prolonged and intense experience of being labeled a unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow, I didn't know that was a shared experience, actually, and that is it's gonna take me a while to process that you shared that with me. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah, so that's a very common experience in terms of, also just, like, I know this one man, he's in his like late 30s, so he's just a little bit younger than me. But, one of his biggest fears was that, like, if he complained to his parents, they would send him to a worse place. Right? Not just fearing the repercussions of, the work projects or the solitary or other methods that they would use to punish kids for, talking shit about the program. But that, because he would hear so much about like other programs that were worse from his peers.
Yep.
And also apparently, like, there is a huge referral process for these things. That's kind of also like the corruption of the referrals, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a very active thing of like, if your, son or daughter, quote unquote, is misbehaving, right? That, that the facilities would contact the parents going like, well, like, we feel they should be transferred to this other facility, usually with, kickbacks and whatnot associated with it. So yeah, that was one of a common major fear that, aside from, again, like being completely unbelieved by everyone and being in an environment, again, that therapeutic community environment where, you have these very vulnerable kids that are broken down, right? And part of that breaking down process is done by the peers, so you don't trust each other. It's, and that was one of the, we can swear on the podcast, so if you need to swear all you want. One of the big mind fucks that, people have described is like, because shared trauma can be this bond. And at the same time, you're like sharing this bond of being a perpetrator as well as a victim all at once together. And that's a really kind of, it negatively impacts kids for life.
It's like they sat down and looked at what could possibly lead to the most long-term damage to your relationships with other people, your relationships with yourself, your self-identity. It's really difficult to think of what they could have possibly done more. And yes, they also use literal brainwashing techniques on us during these life steps. So, yeah. You mentioned referrals, and it's my understanding that the people who did these referrals they often earned a commission. So that's part of my understanding is that's part of the reason why this is considered a corrupt practice, because they were getting commissions for referring, it just happens to cost $3,700 a month.
Right.
A month. And I'm sitting here, I want to go to grad school. And I'm like, oh, okay. For this high school who did this. And I'm trying to go to grad school so that I can get the license to actually provide therapy.
Right.
As opposed to what these people were getting $3,700 a month for.
Right. I mean, and the staff at these places are not getting paid. It is not a well-paid job. Right.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too. That's another major thing of like, constant staff turnovers, creating a really unstable environment for a lot of the kids. So I mean, the damage that gets done in these environments for the children is so significant, because you're also massively fracturing parent-child relationships. You've discussed a little bit of that already. It does damage sibling relationships. Because it's also very common, I can't say it's very common, but I have heard on multiple occasions about how, if one child starts speaking out, then the other one is like, no, I don't think I had the same experience. And that can like permanently ruin relationships between siblings, as well as what you've said about just how damaging it is to healthy relationship development skills in general.
Well, they taught us skills.
Right. I mean, they
Because
call
it's
it,
not-
like you said, you said that like you received quote unquote like life skill lessons, but it seemed more like they, taught you how to abuse each other.
Yes, that's what they taught us. So yeah, you mentioned staff turnover and that the staff was not well paid. It's also not it's not my understanding that that a lot of the staff was well paid. Some of the staff I think was well paid. Let's see, I would say, I would say the administrators were well paid. That was my, even at the time, that's what it seems to me. Whereas the people, certainly the staff who were like monitoring us, I didn't think that they were well paid. And I think that this also set up a dynamic of like a savior complex for the adults who were engaging. Like you said earlier about the power imbalance that can happen when you're like helping, quote unquote, helping somebody who you see as less powerful than you. I think it actually, also encouraged it encouraged an increased importance on seeing what was happening as good, because the staff was doing it out of the good of their hearts, because they just cared about us, because they were addicts before, because they went through the school program before. There were at least 2 people who worked at the program at some point while I was there. At least 3, sorry, who were been through the MBA. Yeah, former graduates.
Right. Well, yeah,
and they were just helping others like they had been helped. They were just there to help children, and they were just there because they cared, and that was their credential.
Right. I mean, that has been a kind of a similar model in the drug rehab industry. The drug rehab industry is one industry where, the vast majority of a lot of staff have had, experience in the rehab industry and as clients, and have come back to work in the industry. Obviously, there are some benefits to it, but you do describe one of the major downsides, right? Which is that if a staff is not critical of the abuse that they've received in those industry and mistaking the abuse as help, these are the staff that are often ones that can be the most enthusiastic about these practices, and also the least enthusiastic about changes within the industry, within the facility, and that can be a very, very, one of the bigger impediments to changing. Because to a certain degree, like, I think in an ideal situation, right, that there can be a industry where, it is based on like compassion and support and care, right? That sometimes, kids aren't necessarily thriving in their family environment, and that, maybe like a good boarding situation where, they are treated well and with compassion and given skills, could be a very positive thing. But again, like, the profit model gets in the way. And I think one of the major things that's really so difficult to disabuse in society is, this concept of people needing to hit rock bottom, people needing consequences, right? Negative, punitive consequences as a part of the learning process. That, like, one of the major things that, a lot of people miss about punishment is that, like, punitive measures only work if we are going to see where it works. It only works in a relationship that is overwhelmingly positive, right? And that it is very brief and it is very rare, right? So, for example, a example would be like, a parent that you have a very, very, very good relationship with 90% of the time, right? And like the one time that they show like very deep disappointment, and they're like, you know what, like we're gonna take your license away for a short while, like that that is a punishment, right? That may actually steer the child into change, but that's not because of the punishment. It's because they've deeply disappointed somebody that they have an overwhelmingly positive, supportive, trusting relationship with. So I think what people need to be disabused of is that you can just ship people and have them be abused by authority figures where there's no trust, and that is somehow some kind of instigator of positive change in people. Right. And especially how damaging it's already extraordinarily damaging to do this to adults, right? That age has, it doesn't matter what age you're treated badly, it's still damaging, but it is especially damaging to developing minds.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't understand. They don't understand. A lot of people see children as little adults. They get angry when children have tantrums. Like, why are you being so irrational? Young children are unable to be rational, especially when they're upset. It's
Right.
actually very normal and developmentally appropriate. So yeah. And, people, all of us, when we were in our teens, there's a lot of like psychological theorists that have talked about, these different stages, but I believe it's Erickson who talked about identity formation.
Yes.
And, you're figuring out who you are. And so to have somebody, nitpicking everything and telling you who you are, like there was a particular life step that I would say was particularly damaging for me personally. But I would say, I don't think that I'm any exception, because as I say, I think it was developmentally particularly damaging because of what Erickson theorized, which is that during this stage in your life, when you're like in your teens and you're like mid-teens, you have a critical question that you're trying to resolve, which is identity formation versus identity dissolution. So are you going to form your identity, or are you going to have difficulty forming your identity and basically set yourself up for a lot of difficulty in understanding who you are and having a coherent sense of self?
Right.
Erickson thought that it was really important at that time. I agree. And I think it's also connected to what we know about neurologically, what's happening with our brains cognitively. I think that this particular stage, there's an overlap of cognitive development, intrapersonal psychological development, and psychosocial development, where you're trying to, at this point in your life, you are finally able to say, oh, I have a place in the whole world, not just in my family. Not only can I choose my place, but there's a bazillion, infinity choices for me, for who I can be, for what I am, for what sense I make of all of my experiences. Finally, when our brains have developed well enough so that we can think abstractly in these ways, and we can think about those kinds of things, when we have that cognitive ability. When you're younger, you don't have the ability to really understand the world around you and your place in it. You just literally cannot. It's just not something it's not a function that your brains can perform. But finally, you've developed enough connections by the time you're in your teens to do that. And so there was one life step, it was called venture. And there was you were given a question in venture it was like your question, a la Erickson. But we all had our own question, and we were yelled at. Okay, so I want to backtrack a little bit. I said that twice a week we were yelled at. I would say that's my perception. I think perhaps we weren't always exactly yelled at, but we were spoken to about negative things, and it was definitely always perceived as an attack. So I just want to backtrack a little bit, but.
Okay.
In Venture, so in all of the life steps, there was a team of facilitators. There were always at least, I think, 2 facilitators, and I think Venture was at least 3 and sometimes 4 during some of it. And yeah, I would say Venture was an attempt at an externalization of resolving those conflicts, but it was in a very contentious way, and everybody was given a different role to play in enacting their question. So my question was, who are you? And as a teenager, it was a very appropriate question, but it was definitely given to me as in, how can you not know who you are? And in fact, Venture, I think, is after I experienced Venture, which I was terrified of having to repeat. You sometimes had to redo life steps. I ended up redoing one called Forever Young, which is universally beloved. But also, which incidentally was the one where I was accused of making up a memory. But as I said, brainwashing techniques were used, and a perfect environment for fake memories, for what's it called? Inserted memories was created. But anyway, Venture, yeah, that was what it was. And mine was, who are you? And it was shortly after that I like, on one of my trips home, I went to a bookstore and I was like, I'm going to get this book on psychology. And I was like, I'm doing something bad. Like, I shouldn't be doing this. And I think I actually brought it back to school. It was like a college textbook on, psychology 101. Mm-hmm. Not because I knew what I know now, which was that it was extremely developmentally inappropriate to accuse someone of not knowing who they were when it was their stage to find out who they were. But yeah, because it was so upsetting for me that I was like, I knew, even though I didn't know it was abuse at the time. And yeah, it took me 10 years. It took me 10 years and finding out there was a lawsuit and finding out the school was closed for me to be like, you know what? That was abuse. And yes, absolutely. Some people are like, well, if you took for so long, then how could it really be abuse? That's what a lot of abuse victims, particularly child abuse victims, but really, I think it's a universal abuse victim experience of people being like, well, you should have known before. But anyway, I picked up that book because I was like, this can't be like, there's something way bigger going on than. Now, I wasn't super critical at the time. I just knew there was something bigger going on than what I had experienced. It really didn't match up what I had experienced. And also, I did not complete Venture. I officially, went through Venture, but I did not complete it. I still feel incomplete. And I think that's, because I was abused and because I'm still, I would say I'm largely healed, but I don't feel that my Venture was ever complete.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
So yeah. So that was just a particular life step that really, really was damaging. And also Venture, I believe, is where a lot of the sexual abuse claims come from, because we had to dress up in a certain way. I don't remember. And I remember we had to dress up in a certain way. And of course you couldn't, of course you had to, the clothing that you had at the school was regulated, but also the things you had to dress up for, not only was there not a lot of variety at the school, but it's things like some people had to dress up like as a stripper. I know one person in my peer group had to dress up as a stripper, and that's where some of the sexual abuse happened.
But was that like some kind of like punishment for promiscuity, or kind of?
No, well, no,
Right.
It wasn't a punishment. It
Okay.
wasn't a punishment. It was an opportunity for us to hit rock bottom in this role that we were playing.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha.
Um,
And that sounds horrifying to force kids to do, right? At like a
it's horrifying for
very
anybody. Yeah.
right, but especially, because it's like on one hand, like I know like somebody could be listening to this going like, oh, like how can being asked who you are at that age is that sounds like such a normal question. How is that so abusive? But again, like those questions being asked in an unsupportive, critical environment, right? It's kind of like the recipe for like, setting people on a path of permanently questioning themselves.
Right. And that's what happened to me. Yeah. And that's why I started out by saying, I think a lot of people don't understand this. I didn't understand it until I learned human development. A lot of people don't understand that teens, there's particular things going on for them cognitively. That's why it's totally inappropriate to, sentence teens as adults, no matter what the teens did.
Right.
And I'm thinking of current events at protests where a teen killed somebody, right?
Right.
I am talking about him.
It's universal. It's a universal thing, right? That, it's not about the crime, but it's about, their place in brain development and emotional development and emotional capacity.
Yes.
Because one of the things about this industry that, like people really often kind of get fixated on like the really extreme and sometimes like, what I call like the lurid details of the industry, right? And one issue with kind of like focusing on just those issues is like, oh, like, if the sexual abuses and the beating stop, the industry is fine, which is kind of the wrong, like those things are wrong regardless, period, right? But like some of like these basic practices, I think, like with starting with like kidnapping kids in the middle of the night, going all the way to like, these therapeutic communities and whatnot, that you don't have to necessarily have these extreme abuse for the industry to be extraordinarily damaging.
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't call it extreme abuse. I would say that a better word is obvious abuse or visible abuse.
Right.
I want to be clear. I've kind of avoided going into the more lurid stuff because I don't appreciate the fixation on it.
Right.
So when I say that that my school was, it was shut down by the Board of Oregon because the board was investigating claims of sexual and physical abuse. I have not yet described the entirety of, for example, the sexual abuse. And I believe I witnessed, which as an adult, as an educator, as a in the USA, I'm a required reporter. It is difficult to not to judge myself for what I witnessed and didn't stop. But of course, as a teenager, I didn't have any power. And the school set up a structure, an environment, a culture where this was totally acceptable to treat people in these ways. It was good for us. It was therapy. It was healing. And
that's damage. I mean, that's so right. That's why I repeatedly say how so much harm in society comes in the language, the guise, and the offer of help, and how that is so damaging. That is so, because like one of the major things is somebody that worked as a counselor in a residential rehab was, how much these experiences actively prevent people from seeking help. Just understandably and reasonably, right? That, once you go through this experience, that you become extraordinarily wary.
Yeah. I've only worked with 2 therapists in my life since then. Of course, I have a very thorough, like, I will not work with a lot of therapists. I will meet with them, and I will just not ever meet with them again. When I did finally start working with a therapist, it was an accident that she discovered that I had CPTSD from this experience. She was the first person, and shortly after she told me, shortly after she said, this sounds like abuse, what you experienced there. Like, she was the first person who really saw what happened to me and gave me any kind of validation that it was damaging. And she attempted to treat me for trauma, but understandably, as a teenager, being put in a confrontational situation, a personally confrontational situation, where it was not always facilitators who. So, like, in a Synanon, in what you do, you sit in a circle because you're a group together. You're doing this together. What are the rules? You cannot give anybody tissues. Because it can shut them off and stop them from crying. You can't touch anybody either, because God forbid you comfort someone.
Right. That's actually so common in a lot of group therapy standards, by the way.
To some extent.
Right.
Yes. To some extent, absolutely. Hell no.
Right. Well, I mean, when I used to lead groups, I always used to leave it up to the individual, right? That, like, if you want comforting, please let us know. I have tissue set aside for, people that need it. Like, please, do this based on your own individual needs.
Yeah. And I get that. And also, as somebody who's entering the therapy field, I know that there's the way Western therapy has developed, and this is totally a tangent, kind of, sort of, but, like, there's a real importance placed on therapist-client distance, and I fundamentally disagree with that. Insert, like, boundaries, absolutely, very clear boundaries. And having the distance can help you have those boundaries. But when you have children who are, talking about things, okay, all people need nurturing. Children need it. Like, talk about, you can't spoil a baby, which some people don't know.
Right.
You cannot possibly spoil a baby. You cannot spoil it with attention. There might be medical issues, but, like, you cannot feed the baby too often, and you cannot give it too much love and too much attention. And children, developing humans, need care and nurturing, and they need to feel safe. Anybody needs to feel safe in a therapeutic environment.
Absolutely.
And safety was absolutely lacking for everybody in this. And, if you confront someone and there's no sense of safety, you are punishing them for vulnerability. And that's part of how it sets you up for a lifetime of struggling with vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. We are coming up past the hour, so I know you wanted to limit this to an hour for yourself.
Yeah, it's tiring. It's emotionally very draining to talk about this. And I feel like we've talked about some things that I wanted to talk about. I really, really hope listeners, I really hope more people understand childism, that as a society, we don't value children. We don't respect them. And children are people. Children are not little adults. They do not have the same control as adults.
No.
And that's okay. That's normal. That's extremely normal. For a child to have the same composure as an adult is an indication of abuse. And
or it's an indication of, trauma, neglect, a lot of things. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it might not be, but it's a big red flag. A big red flag.
I mean, absolutely. Can children be mature for their age? Do certain experiences, for example, loss of a parent, things like that kind of, sometimes children do react in a way of, being more composed and often, oftentimes these are the children that take on like some of the parental duties in family. Is what
Yeah.
you find in like the extremely mature and composed children, right? That they if they don't
Yeah.
if they don't have siblings, they're parenting themselves, or if they have siblings, they have taken on a lot of parenting roles a lot of times in their family, and that also that has repercussions.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, for my family dynamic, my father died when I was 11. My older brother was 17. Well, I was 10, and our birthdays were shortly after. I was 10. My older brother was 16, and my younger brother was 2. And my mom had a toddler. My mom was a new widow. After just a year of terrifying, just watching your partner die from lung cancer, and of course metastasizing, and all of the pain and everything with that. It always infuriates me to hear people be like, talk about how much they respect people they were sick, but they powered through. Being sick, and I also speak from a personal experience, is what the fuck? Like, no, no,
Right.
anger, refusing to accept it. Certainly what my dad did. He did not want to leave his children, he didn't want to die. And anyways, it was quite painful, quite difficult for the entire family. And so my father died, and my mom was a new widow, and she had a toddler. And she had a teenager who was dealing with things and she was having difficulty with. And she had a 10-year-old who liked to read and was quiet and enjoyed being in my room with my pets. And thus began a lifetime of dissociating and making myself, taking care of myself. Because that was my, the middle child, and also, such extreme differences, in our ages. I was the easy child in many ways. Certainly at that time, I was the easy child. Obviously, once I became a teenager, my behavior became perceived as unmanageable. I wanted to talk about the developmental stuff, and I just really hope listeners, we got to have more people knowing this about kids. We got to stop treating kids the way that we do. We need to give children rights. Children's human rights need to be protected. And there's a group that's really working on that called Unsilenced. They've been really, there's a lot of people in DC right now. I know there's a bill that's they're trying to push through. I don't know a lot of details about it. It's tough for me to read about this stuff and engage with this stuff. It's very triggering. So I don't know about the details, but I hope people look into it. I hope that you ask your whoever needs to vote for it. This industry largely needs to be stopped. Definitely needs to be regulated, because it is not regulating itself. It is not. I myself am an anarchist, and I don't believe in hierarchy. But I do believe that people need protection, and there needs to be protection of children, and it's not happening. And God, that's the future of humanity. Like, of all the most important things, global warming and children's rights, are our priorities, but they are not practically our priorities.
Well, children are kind of abstractions in our society a lot of times, right? That there's so much kind of, of wanting to quote unquote protect them and all these things, while, in reality, right, schools are falling apart. Just basic parents, taking time out, after the birth of a child is difficult enough, right? That, ultimately at the end of the day, whether an adult or a child, I really do want to get away from this model that, when people behave in an unwanted way, that it is almost always about some kind of unmet need.
Yeah.
And not about some kind of, innate quality of the person. These are not bad children, right? These are not bad people. These are people with unmet needs who need, in order to heal, to be treated with sincerity, with compassion, and also be like, again, like one of the things about being vulnerable, whether you're a child, whether you're an adult, right, is being placed in this position of unreliable narrator, right? That, maybe for somebody that's clearly not oriented, for example, that have, had the psychotic break and have completely lost orientation. Okay, like they are temporarily in that state, right? An unreliable narrator. But like there is this. Right. But they need help.
For healing, they need to, get to that place and be supported in getting to that place authentically, not in a way that the people working with them think matches,
Right.
something.
Exactly. And so that's one of the oh, go ahead, Liam.
Yeah, no, it's just fascinating, the misuse of words. And I think that's the thing, obviously, that's part of the thing that takes time to sort of filter through later in life. Is it sort of strikes me this idea of even the naming of those bits of the program, life step, is sort of fascinating because there's a sort of level of arrogance, right? Like it's like, we know what life is and we know how you're supposed to live it right, and you're going to step in the direction that we think is correct. And there's just a level of, and so you're being lied to in these sort of achievement criteria. And then, like you say, you go through this sort of grueling process that's called healing. It, on so many levels, just you're being sort of lied to every single day. And that sort of not knowing where the ground is below your feet, or not having a sense of identity, under sort of healthier circumstances, having open-ended questions about yourself, about your identity, about your place in life, in the universe, is actually totally fine. Not having all the answers is fine. But again, you're in this system that demands a conformity and demands a certain way of being in the world, which is, it's all very authoritative and, kind of, again, the arrogance of all of it. It's easy to say it now from this sort of detached perspective, particularly that where I'm coming from, but just, I can understand completely why it was confusing, and it takes a lot of time to unpick all of that sort of crap programming that they're doing.
Yeah. Who are you is an absolutely appropriate question for a teenager. It's a rich question. It's a wonderful opportunity to explore something wonderful. It's awesome. I love being a high school teacher. I love 8th grade. That's a notorious grade.
I also like working with teenagers. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Oh man, my 8th graders, there's nothing like an 8th grader who hates you. Oh man, I'm not going to name names, but there is one student I will never forget the way she looked at me every single class. Just amazing. Rolling her eyes without rolling her eyes. Like just the expression of disdain.
Teenagers have, I think adults lose that ability as we age, of like this unfettered, pure disdain, right? Yeah. But and
I love it. I respect it because they are expressing however they can. Teenagers have more stress than any other age group. All teenagers, just the TTI
Right.
ones.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's also, I mean, like, you know, you also have like this incredible hormonal shift
Yeah.
that you're going through, which has, you know, major implications to, you know, so many things.
Right.
Right. You know, this is a time when kids need like a lot of sleep and a lot of nurturing, as well as like an opportunity. One of the major things, right, the I often say is that, like, you know, our society does not give people the ability to grow because we do not give people the opportunity to fail safely.
Yeah. Yeah. And, speaking of the time, I'd really like to close off by maybe just talking a little bit about, what would a good such program for teens and families who need support look like. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
Was there anything else that you two really wanted to look at, or?
No, I just thought the question I did want to ask is what you liked about the wilderness stuff, because you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah,
but
right.
I imagine this actually rolls into your answer or your ending.
Could be. I will just say I had to go to wilderness because basically I was not ready to open up, and I refused. I was like, I'm not going to be inauthentic. I'm not going to. And I apologized. Like, basically somebody had just like poured himself out to me at my peer. And I was like, I thank you for sharing that with me, but I don't know you. I don't feel comfortable telling you. I don't know why I'm here. Like, I have nothing to say. Like, I refused. It was officially what I did wrong was I refused to cooperate. And so I did end up actually staying with you're talking about these people who kidnapped children. It was kidnapping. It's kidnapping. They're called escorts in the industry. So I, refused at an inconvenient time. And the escorts, I guess they were like waiting to like kidnap someone. So I was kicked out of the MBA, and I just lived with the escorts for a while. And that's when I tried to run away. My one time I tried to run away during the program. And I was very bad at running away. I was gone for like a few hours. Anyway, so yeah, I lived with them for a while, and like they were pretty nice to me, It's weird to think about, the fact that they were literally kidnapping children. I'm assuming you've talked about that a little bit before.
Yeah.
On this.
Yeah.
Okay. And then me, along with some other kids, we were driven to Idaho, from Oregon, and it was 21 days in the Idaho desert, high desert. It was in the springtime before the cows were let out. So the cow pies were like nice and dry, great for starting fires. And I've always loved nature. I loved it. I loved sleeping outside. God, awesome. And the therapy that we did was quite mild, not confrontational. And there was like one point where we actually had psychologists, like they drove out and met us in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
And I don't know, I felt that I could talk authentically with that and like and really truly share with that person. I don't know I don't remember what the heck I said, but,
it wasn't a punitive environment.
I didn't see it as punitive. A lot of people don't, they want to take showers.
Oh, right.
And yeah, we were literally 21 days in the middle of nowhere. I loved it, which speaks about me as a person, I suppose. Oh God, I loved making my own fire. And actually, I just recently learned about horticultural therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like nature therapy is a thing. I'm going to be taking a class later this year on, I'm getting credentialed right now as a expressive arts, trauma-informed educator coach. Because I'm not yet a licensed professional. So that's the certification available for me. And I'm going to be taking a class in nature and expressive arts, using nature for healing. And yeah, absolutely. Nature can, I mean, right. That is, that's where we came from. That is where we belong. So, and I happen to love it, but of course, lots of kids were, uncomfortable, and we were very dirty, very dirty when we came out.
Right. I mean, I think the positive, because I do know few people that have had positive experience with this industry, but the ones that did, all of them were like, oh yeah, like one of them was on a farm where he took care of like horses and sheep and goats, right? And he was just like, oh yeah, like I loved it. I loved all the time I spent taking care of these animals. Like that was great, So all of them kind of involved that some aspect of that. But yeah, I think ultimately, one of the major things that I think that does need to be addressed is this idea that like you have to remove kids from their family.
Yeah,
right.
I just want to backtrack just a little bit, because I know that some kids died during wilderness programs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I did not feel physically too taxed. Almost all of the time, most of the time. But I mean, we were going, what did we do? We would do 10 miles. 10 miles, I think, was a high mileage. Carrying everything on your back in the desert. We had water pumps and everything. I would say we usually had, I don't know, we were pushed to our physical limits, and I was able to do it. But I can definitely, obviously, some programs, I don't think that Seuss had any children die, but I imagine that they probably definitely had some medical incidents.
Right.
So I think they really pushed us really hard. And I do doubt that really all of the kids who are participating were really physically pushed to their outer limits or past, and they should not have been pushed past. I loved it. I loved pushing I've always loved that. I've always loved pushing my body in that way.
Right.
And it's okay that not everybody loved wilderness, not everybody loved being dirty. I'm not saying at all that that was just my experience. I just happened to love it. So anyway, I don't want anybody to get the misunderstanding that wilderness programs are great.
No. They should.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the major things, right? Is that kids aren't often matched to the programs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we were shunted there because we were inconvenienced somewhere else. Or like I said, this program was also for people who courts would recommend people
right
to the program. People would be given a choice, like it's either this or like, I don't know, juvie, or this, or like a treatment, a lockdown facility.
Right. So one of the major things, in terms of like making the industry better is one, like, having a lot more like in-home help for the parents, usually.
Yes.
Like, parents and kids, in terms of much more accessible intensive therapy. Right.
Yeah, because no matter what happens, that is that child's family. And I was estranged. I estranged myself from my mother. And as a result, my younger brother, because of course he lived with her, it deeply damaged our family, because I was very angry at my mother for a long time. And the only reason we have a relationship now is because I decided to be like, she did the best she could. I wouldn't say that I've forgiven her. I don't think I need to forgive her to find some peace, and to say, I would say I did more of a radical acceptance kind of thing. Like, this is what happened.
Right.
I'm also against people. It's not forgiveness that you need. I don't, people say, oh, you need forgiveness for yourself. You don't need forgiveness. You need acceptance.
Right.
And some people might choose to forgive. They might like that. That might be good for them. But I really disagree that it's forgiveness that's needed to let it go and to move on and to heal. Anyway,
I agree. I agree. The Buddhist also agrees. All right.
But no matter what, that child is going to go back to that family, whether they're estranged or not. Even if you're estranged, that you're estranged from your family.
Right.
And yeah, what we learn when you actually become licensed and get educated in this stuff, is treating the family is of paramount importance. And when I was working in special ed, working with the family was a major part of how we supported the children. You cannot support the child without working with the family. You cannot. That is what professionals know.
Yes. Yes.
And in my situation, my mother did not participate at all.
Right.
I would say she did one thing. There was one part where we were given like a history of our family, and she did send something to me about that. That's one time where I remember her participating. And I think I spoke to her on the phone, and I was able to send letters to her, but I don't recall a lot of getting letters back. Yeah, very isolated. Anyway, sorry. About what would be good. Working with families, like even families who are really struggling. I mean, just basically families in the US need way more support, like you were talking about parental leave. Families are, and just recent events,
right,
with the Supreme Court, families are not, just flat out, families are not supported in the US, just period.
No, I mean, it's hard enough. I think parenting is really difficult in general, and I think to a certain degree that's why multi-generational parenting used to be a thing, right? It was really common for grandparents to live with one or two grandparents living with a family and kind of sharing, duties of like families kind of living close to each other, where uncles, also aside from grandparents, uncles and aunts and older cousins and whatnot. And it was kind of like, and again, if you have a great family, that this works extraordinarily well. If you have an extremely abusive family, it could compound, right? Yeah. Instead of just having like one abusive parent, you have like an entire family. So it's, again, not an ideal situation in all the situations, but so many things about our society have made parenting more difficult, but also parenting more criminalized.
Particularly for people of color,
right? And for people in poverty, right? So it's
right.
It's just like this relentless gauntlet of for both children and parents, right? Because schools have become, I mean, I remember I'm guessing I'm older than you because I'm in the later part of my 40s. So it's one of those things where I was kind of like the last cohort in my, in education where we actually still had arts programs, music programs, school orchestras where if you couldn't afford an instrument, that you could loan an instrument from the school, things like that, and we've kind of, turned it into this testing, environment.
Yeah. So I totally agree. Having a whole education is part of what supports what would be much better for teenagers who are struggling, providing support for the family. And as you say, parents need help. My mom needed help. And so that's part of what it was for me. My mom needed help. She was a single parent. She never planned on having 3 kids alone.
Right.
Ever. And she was a doctor. She was, she had a private practice. She would also regularly work in the ER. She was regularly, but she was taking care of a lot of people, in addition to her children. And parenting is very difficult for any single parent. I promise, I'm going to just do a tangent. The school was expensive. And a lot of the people there were quite rich. My family, I would say, was maybe middle class, but my mom spent all of her money on my program. And I graduated because, and I learned this afterwards, I graduated because my mom had called the administrators and said, I don't have any more money, so I'm going to pull my child out. If you don't, I'm going to pull my child out. So So they graduated me, and I appreciate that was nice of them. But in retrospect, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense that I didn't actually graduate. They didn't want me to. Anyway, so my family did have some finances, but not enough, or at least certainly not enough to support a $3,700 a month school. So having resources helped my mom because she was able to do that. But what she needed was support. Like, I don't know what kind of support she would have accepted, right? But she needed support for sure. And I also want to say just real quick, like, I totally agree, like multi-generational, like living experiences, whether it's a close-knit community or a family living in a home together, are good they're good for parents and they're good for kids. As I've gotten older, I've really understood how important community is, how healing community is, which is something I had to learn because my experience, sorry about my dogs, they're playing right now. My experience with community at the school was terrifying. And so experiencing the healing of community was huge for me, has been huge for me as an adult. I think that community is needed in healing. So what you said about that, I think was really important. And also I want to say, the concept of the good enough parent, it's usually called the good enough mother, which of course we want to, anybody can be a nurturing parent, the primary nurturing parent. But of being good enough, there's not good parents and bad parents. There's definitely bad parents. There's definitely good parents and bad parents. Sorry. That's not all there is though. You can make mistakes. And in fact, it's extremely healthy. And the reparative experiences are, according to the research I've seen, can be far more powerful than just having a good relationship, actually. Having a relationship where you don't have those experiences of repair. I mean, what are you going to do when you have problems in life, which everyone does? I mean, that just doesn't happen. Sorry, that just never happens. No one's perfect all the time. But the reparative experiences are huge. So facilitating, supporting parents in those reparations, not to be confused with, racial reparations, but in those reparative experiences with their children when they're having difficulties. I would say keep children in, non-abusive homes whenever possible. Is going to be better for the kids and for the families.
I think that's one aspect that's really often forgotten. The only one other thing, and this can be gendered, but also not gendered because, it can impact LGBT and like non-gender conforming kids as well as, girls. But there a lot, I have found that like a lot of girls that I have known over the years that ended up in those industries ended up because of concerns around promiscuity. And that and that requires educating parents, not just children, right? That like one of the concepts around sex education is always focused on like school and children. And a lot of times I'm just like, the people that need a lot of sex education are fucking parents. Right. And it's not necessarily just about the anatomy, but how do you deal with children and sexuality over the various the 18 plus years of their life as they become more aware.
I absolutely noticed a huge difference in how my older brother's independence was supported versus mine. It was a very clear message. I was not to be independent and he would be supported in independence. That was the message for me. I don't know what his experience was, but that was my perception. And I would say my biggest crime for which my biggest, mistake or problem for which I was sent was, having sex with a lovely person, lovely person who I'm still very good friends with to this day, and who will not speak to my mother.
Right. Because that has been one of the major reasons that girls get sent away to these institutions. That I have noticed that doesn't really, because there's so much panic around children and sexuality, right? That that's one area where a lot of parents were like, oh yeah, just ship them away to where they're safe and won't have sex. And
it's one step down from a nunnery.
Yeah, although, maybe nunneries would be better than some of these places.
It would have been far better. I wish that had happened. Of course, I would have hated it.
Right, but yeah, so, I mean, so much, that requires changing in this industry, a lot of it is, one, changing societal attitudes about children and societal attitudes about what promotes behavior change. That we have major misunderstandings in those two areas.
Yeah, science-based.
Yes.
Not spanking, not punishment, as you said earlier, which I really appreciated the nuance with which you talked about that. And just like I said, an understanding of what human development is and what is appropriate behavior, what is common behavior, what is a common struggle, what is this kind of, so a developmental understanding, developmental based, family based support, developmental based support, individual, community, community support. I think that those would be good ways to help to address a child who is acting out.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, perfect. I mean, thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk, and I really appreciated that the preparation that we had beforehand. That really helped me to make sure this was great.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Sheena Belmas, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Bruce Rogers Vaughan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.